What I feel after all of this is it's not about punishing. If somebody has, is struggling and has difficulties, you don't punish them for that. And I think a lot of these programs feel like the kid is being punished. And I don't think that's a great way to go. You're a parent and you think, here's my kid running out into the streets, going to get hit by a truck. You want to keep them.
The room went quiet when Rob Reiner finally spoke. Not because he raised his voice, but because of what he chose to reveal after decades of carefully guarded silence. For years, the Reiner name has been synonymous with success, creativity, and Hollywood royalty. A legendary father, an iconic career, a family everyone assumed was solid behind the scenes. But on what many are now calling a final reckoning moment, Rob didn't talk about movies, awards, or legacy. He talked about the truth, and what he admitted stunned even those closest to him. This wasn't a scandal leaked by tabloids or whispered by insiders. This was Rob Reiner himself, looking back at his life and pulling the curtain back on a family story that had been buried under fame, loyalty, and fear of public fallout. Fans who thought they knew everything about the Reiner dynasty suddenly realized they only knew the version that was safe to show. Those watching closely could feel it immediately. This wasn't confession for attention. It was confession out of exhaustion, of someone who had reached a point where protecting the image no longer mattered as much as unburdening the truth. Old interviews suddenly felt different. Long-standing family tensions made sense. Silences that once seemed normal now felt deliberate. Rob hinted at generational damage, at choices made in the name of success that quietly cost the people closest to him, at moments when loyalty demanded silence, even when that silence hurt. And when he said, "I waited too long to say this," it landed like a punch to the chest. Because if Rob Reiner is finally telling the truth now, the question everyone is asking is simple and chilling. What happened inside this family that couldn't be spoken about until the very end? For decades, Rob Reiner mastered the art of control. Control of narrative, control of image, control of what the public was allowed to see versus what stayed locked away behind closed doors. He built a career on storytelling, on shaping emotions, on deciding where the camera points and when it notices pain. But on this last day, when he finally sat with the weight of his own history, control slipped in a way no one expected. Those close to him say the moment didn't come with fanfare. No press tour, no dramatic announcement. Just a quiet decision that whatever time he had left could no longer be spent protecting a version of his family that wasn't whole. When Rob began speaking, it wasn't polished. His words weren't rehearsed. They came out uneven, heavy, like stones he'd been carrying for far too long. The Reiner family has always been viewed as Hollywood royalty, a legendary father whose voice shaped generations. A son who became one of the most respected filmmakers in the industry. Success layered on success. Laughter layered over silence. From the outside, it looked solid, but Rob admitted that behind the accolades, there was an agreement everyone followed without ever naming it. Certain things would never be discussed. Not because they weren't real, but because acknowledging them threatened the foundation everything else was built on. According to people who have known the family for years, there were always moments that didn't quite add up. Long stretches of distance between relatives, conversations that stopped when certain names came up, emotional walls disguised as professionalism, as respect, as that's just how things are. Rob now suggests those weren't quirks. They were coping mechanisms. He spoke about growing up in a house where success was loud and emotions were quiet, where approval came through achievement, not vulnerability, where love existed but conditions were attached to it. That environment, he said, taught him early that silence was safer than honesty, especially when the truth might disappoint people you're supposed to admire. The dark secret he alluded to wasn't a single event. It was a pattern of suppression, of unspoken pain passed down and repackaged as resilience, of family members learning to play their roles so well that no one questioned what it cost them internally. Rob admitted that he became very good at distraction, humor, work, productivity, anything that kept the focus away from what felt unstable underneath. What stunned listeners most wasn't the content, but the timing. Why now? Why after all these years? Rob hinted that the answer was regret. Regret for the conversations he never had, the apologies he never made, the people he loved but never fully let see him. He acknowledged that protecting the family image came at the expense of emotional truth, and that choice had consequences he couldn't undo. According to an alleged insider, there were family members who knew this moment was coming and were terrified of it. Not because Rob planned to expose anyone, but because once the silence breaks, it can't be restored. Old wounds start breathing again. Long buried emotions demand space. And not everyone is ready for that reckoning. Rob spoke carefully about generational weight, about how traits get inherited not just through DNA, but through behavior, through what's modeled, through what's avoided. He admitted he repeated patterns he once promised himself he'd never continue, not out of malice, but out of habit. And realizing that, he said, was one of the most painful truths he's ever had to face. Fans watching this unfold felt unsettled in a quiet way. This wasn't scandal. It was something more uncomfortable: recognition. Many people saw their own families reflected in his words. The unsaid rules, the loyalty that demands silence, the idea that loving someone sometimes means never telling them how deeply they hurt you. Social media didn't explode the way it does with gossip. It slowed down. Comment sections filled with long reflections instead of hot takes. People shared stories about parents who were admired publicly but unreachable privately, about growing up surrounded by success but starved for emotional safety. Rob's revelation wasn't entertaining, it was sobering. He admitted that for years, he told himself it was too late to change the narrative, that the family had survived by not talking about certain things, so why disturb the peace now? But he realized that what he called peace was actually avoidance. And avoidance, he said, doesn't disappear with age, it hardens. The most chilling part of his revelation came when he said, almost to himself, "I thought time would soften it. It didn't." That line hung in the air, because it acknowledged a truth many people avoid. Time doesn't heal what's never addressed. It just buries it deeper. Rob made it clear he wasn't seeking forgiveness. He wasn't rewriting history. He was simply naming what had been unnamed for too long. He spoke about wanting his final chapter to be honest, even if that honesty made people uncomfortable, even if it changed how he's remembered. According to those close to him, some family members were deeply emotional hearing this. Others were angry. Some felt exposed. Others felt relieved. That range of reactions alone confirmed what Rob had been hinting at. The silence had never meant the same thing to everyone. As this first part of his truth settled in, one thing became impossible to ignore. Rob Reiner wasn't just revealing something about his family. He was challenging the idea that legacy is built only on success. He was asking whether a name means anything if it costs you authenticity. And as people waited to hear what he might say next, a quiet tension took hold. Because if this is what he's finally willing to admit now, what else has he been holding back all these years? As Rob Reiner continued, the weight of what he was carrying became impossible to ignore. This was no longer a reflective confession wrapped in nostalgia. This was excavation. He wasn't just naming the silence, he was pulling apart the reasons it existed, piece by piece, even when doing so clearly cost him emotional comfort. He began talking about fear. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, disciplined fear that teaches you how to behave in a family where reputation matters more than vulnerability. According to Rob, there was an unspoken understanding that certain truths, once spoken aloud, could fracture everything the family had built. And so, everyone learned to speak around the truth instead of through it. He described moments from his early adulthood when he sensed something was deeply wrong, not scandalous, not criminal, but emotionally corrosive. Power imbalances that were normalized, feelings that were dismissed as weakness, pain that was intellectualized instead of felt. He admitted that when he tried to raise questions, they were often met with humor or deflection. Laughter became a shield. Wit became a weapon to keep conversations from going where they weren't allowed. Rob acknowledged his father's towering presence, not with accusation, but with complexity. He spoke about admiration mixed with intimidation, about how difficult it is to form your own emotional language when the person you're supposed to look up to sets the tone for what's acceptable to feel. In that environment, Rob said, being sensitive felt like a liability, not a strength. According to people familiar with the family, this dynamic rippled outward. Siblings learned different survival strategies. Some leaned into silence, others into achievement, others into distance. But all of them, Rob suggested, learned that harmony was maintained by not asking too many questions. What made this part of his revelation especially unsettling was his admission that he became an enforcer of that silence himself. Not consciously, not maliciously, but through avoidance, through redirecting conversations, through telling himself that keeping the peace was an act of love. He confessed that there were times when he knew a family member was hurting deeply, and instead of sitting with that discomfort, he encouraged them to move forward, to focus on the positive, to not dwell. Listening back now, he said, those phrases felt hollow. He talked about the guilt that comes with realizing you benefited from a system that hurt people you cared about. That success gave him insulation, options, resources, distractions, while others carried the emotional cost without escape. That realization, he admitted, has haunted him more than any professional regret. According to an alleged insider, this was the moment when some family members stopped listening. Not because Rob was lying, but because the truth was too destabilizing. When someone finally names the pattern everyone's been tiptoeing around, it forces others to confront their own roles in maintaining it. Rob also spoke about generational inheritance, how silence doesn't end with one generation unless someone actively breaks it. He admitted that despite his awareness, he repeated many of the same emotional habits in his own parenting, prioritizing structure over softness, achievement over expression. He said the most painful realization of his life was seeing echoes of his own childhood in moments where he'd unintentionally shut someone down. That admission landed hard with viewers. Social media filled with comments from people saying, "This is my family," not in anger, in recognition. Older women, especially, spoke about how often emotional labor falls unevenly within families and how silence is framed as strength when it's actually exhaustion. Rob didn't excuse himself. He didn't ask for understanding. He said plainly that knowing better and doing better are not the same thing, and that for too long, he hid behind the idea that good intentions were enough. He also revealed that the decision to speak now was influenced by loss. Watching people leave this world without ever having certain conversations forced him to confront the cost of delay. He admitted there are people he will never be able to apologize to directly. That reality, he said, was unbearable to carry into the end of his life without at least trying to tell the truth publicly. According to sources close to the family, this admission reopened old wounds almost immediately. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages were sent and unsent. Some relatives felt exposed. Others felt validated. The family, once united by silence, was now divided by honesty. Rob addressed the backlash preemptively. He acknowledged that some would accuse him of rewriting history or seeking absolution. He said neither was true. He wasn't asking to be forgiven. He was trying to be accurate. And accuracy, he said, is often more uncomfortable than blame. He also warned that naming the truth doesn't fix everything. It doesn't magically heal relationships or undo decades of damage. Sometimes it just creates clarity, and clarity can be devastating. But he insisted that devastation was still preferable to living a lie. The most haunting moment of this section came when Rob admitted that part of him still wanted to stop talking, still wanted to retreat, that the urge to protect the family image didn't disappear just because he recognized it. That urge, he said, was deeply ingrained. Speaking now felt like going against muscle memory built over a lifetime. That confession resonated deeply, because it revealed that breaking cycles isn't heroic or cinematic. It's exhausting, it's lonely, and it often comes too late to spare everyone involved. As this second layer of his truth settled, one thing became clear. Rob Reiner wasn't just exposing a dark secret. He was exposing how easily love, loyalty, and silence can intertwine until no one remembers where one ends and the other begins. And as the audience sat with that realization, the tension deepened. Because if this is what he's willing to admit about himself, what does that say about the people who still refuse to speak? And what happens to a family when the story they survived by can no longer hold them together? By the time Rob Reiner reached what many now see as the final layer of his revelation, there was no attempt left to soften the impact. The careful language, the measured tone, the intellectual framing, all of that began to fall away. What remained was something far more unsettling. A man confronting the realization that truth, once delayed too long, doesn't arrive gently. It arrives heavy, it arrives late, and it arrives without guaranteeing forgiveness. Rob spoke about the aftermath he always feared but could never fully imagine. How once silence is broken, the people who benefited from it and the people who were harmed by it rarely experience relief at the same time. He admitted that some family members responded with anger so sharp it shocked him, while others responded with a grief that felt endless. Both reactions, he said, made sense, both were valid, and neither could be fixed with explanations. According to people close to the family, the days following his revelation were marked by distance rather than dialogue. Not explosive arguments, but quiet withdrawals, missed calls, short messages, long gaps. The kind of emotional retreat that signals people are reevaluating everything they thought they understood about their shared history. Rob acknowledged that this outcome was always a possibility, and that accepting it was part of choosing honesty. He spoke candidly about legacy, not as something engraved on awards or remembered in obituaries, but as something that lives inside the people you leave behind. He admitted that for most of his life, he equated legacy with accomplishment, with influence, with being remembered as successful. But now, at the end, he realized that legacy is also measured by what people felt safe saying around you and what they felt forced to hide. That realization, he said, was devastating. Rob acknowledged that there are family members who may never speak to him again, and that this truth weighs heavily on him. But he also admitted something even more uncomfortable. That continuing to stay silent would have meant abandoning himself completely. He framed his choice not as courage, but as necessity. "I didn't speak because I was brave," he said. "I spoke because I couldn't carry it anymore." That line alone reframed everything. This wasn't a confession meant to control the narrative. It was the collapse of a narrative that had already failed internally. Rob spoke about how maintaining the family image required constant emotional negotiation, deciding what to remember, what to forget, and what to reinterpret until it no longer felt painful. Over time, he said, that process hollowed him out. According to an alleged insider, some family members accused Rob of centering himself in a story that belonged to many people. Others argued that he was finally doing what should have been done decades ago. That divide, insiders say, may never fully heal. And Rob seemed to accept that reality with a kind of weary clarity. He also addressed the idea of dark secrets directly, clarifying that darkness doesn't always mean scandal. Sometimes it means neglect, emotional absence, the quiet harm of never being fully seen. He said the family's greatest secret wasn't a single event, but the collective agreement to pretend certain pain didn't matter as long as everyone kept functioning. That admission struck a nerve, because it challenged the idea that families fall apart only through dramatic acts. Sometimes they fracture slowly, through omission, through silence dressed up as love, through loyalty that demands endurance instead of honesty. Rob spoke about forgiveness carefully. He didn't ask for it, he didn't expect it. He said forgiveness, if it comes at all, must come from a place of truth, not obligation. And he acknowledged that some people may never forgive him, not for what he did, but for what he waited too long to do. That honesty felt final. As he reflected on the end of his life, Rob said something that lingered long after the words were spoken. He said the most painful part of this reckoning wasn't losing relationships. It was realizing how much connection might have been possible if the truth had been spoken earlier. That grief, he said, has no resolution. You don't move past it, you learn to live alongside it. Social media reactions at this stage were no longer divided or reactive. They were contemplative. People wrote about their own regrets, about parents they never confronted, about siblings they lost to silence, about the cost of waiting for the right time to speak honestly. Rob's story had become less about him and more about what happens when truth is postponed until it becomes unbearable. He ended not with a dramatic conclusion, but with acceptance. Acceptance that his family may never fully reconcile. Acceptance that his truth may complicate his legacy. Acceptance that honesty doesn't always heal, but silence almost always wounds. And in that acceptance, there was something quietly powerful. Because Rob Reiner wasn't offering redemption. He was offering reality. A reminder that families are not sustained by image, but by emotional safety. That success doesn't cancel out unresolved pain, and that the stories we refuse to tell shape us just as much as the ones we celebrate. As this chapter closed, one thing was unmistakable. The Reiner family story will never be viewed the same way again. Not because of scandal, but because of vulnerability finally acknowledged. And for those watching, listening, and reflecting, the final question wasn't about Rob Reiner at all. It was about themselves. What truths are we still carrying quietly? And how long do we think we have before they demand to be spoken? If you stayed through all of this, it's because something in Rob Reiner's words hit closer to home than Hollywood ever does. This wasn't gossip. It wasn't scandal. It was a reminder of how many families survive by staying silent and how much that silence can cost over a lifetime. What Rob revealed wasn't easy to hear because it forces all of us to ask questions we've been avoiding in our own lives. Now we want to hear from you. Do you believe it's ever too late to tell the truth? Or do you think some silences, once held too long, change everything forever? Was Rob brave for speaking now, or did the delay make the truth even more painful? Share your thoughts in the comments. not just opinions, but reflections. Stories like this matter because they mirror real families, real regrets, and real choices. If this conversation moved you, make sure you like this video so it reaches others who may need to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because stories like this don't end when the video does. When more truths surface, when families respond, or when long-held silence finally breaks elsewhere, you'll want to be here for it. Some stories entertain us, others challenge us. This one asks us to look inward, and that's why it matters.